And welcome everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are in the world. It's morning here in Florida, as Blair described. And we're really glad that you're able to join us. For those of you that know us well, you know that since 1997, we have reached out to the world through a course that we've taught, a lot of courses we've taught, but our flagship was a 2-week course that we did in conjunction and still do in conjunction with the World Bank. But during COVID, we've not been able to do that. And that's really tugged at our heartstrings because we really enjoy working with all of you. We're going to, again, we're relaunching the course in October, and we hope that many people can make it. We know that there's still a lot of challenges in getting to different places in the world. But just to kind of help us ease into that, we've decided to have what we call some pre-PURC sessions. Ted Curry offered one on financing infrastructure. We're going to talk in this one about how do we expand broadband, especially during this particular time. Before I jump into the content, though, I also want to let you know that we'll be bringing one of my good friends, Commissioner Mignon Clyburn, to the UF campus in September. So look out for announcements about that. She's a former commissioner at the Federal Communications Commission in the United States. I knew her back when she was a state regulator. One of her passions has always been, how do you get broadband into the hands of marginalized groups? And she has not just a particular passion for it, a deep knowledge, and she has some really unique leadership skills that at the right moment she was ready to use, and she got things done that no one else had been able to do at the FCC. So we're bringing her here to campus to let people learn from her, but that's also going to be broadcast. So we're hoping that a lot of you will be able to join and learn from Mignon. She's just a remarkable woman in the things that she does, both in policy and in providing leadership. So let's just jump into our topic for today. Let me get my screen shared. Blair, I'll need some help with that because it's saying my screen sharing is disabled.
Okay. Let's try. Now try.
All right, that works. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
All right, can you see that okay?
Yes.
All right, very good. So let's jump into this. As you've all experienced, as we've all gone through this COVID experience together, broadband has become really important, and people have gotten very concerned about maybe there's not enough broadband available, maybe it's not in everybody's hands as it should be. So people have been thinking about this and trying to develop different ways of making it more available, more affordable. And so we want to talk about what are some options that you have in that particular area. Let me start with how we're just going to approach this. We're going to talk for about 45 more minutes. Ask questions during that time if you wish. Blair will be passing them along to me, but I'll reserve the last 10 minutes, especially just to talk through particular issues. Here's how we're going to approach this. We're going to start with, why does this matter now? Where do we think there are gaps, problems, who might have them? Our present method for trying to address gaps, private competition amongst private operators. We'll talk about government ownership, about public-private partnerships, what about regulating prices, and then if we're going to subsidize, who's going to provide those subsidies? So let's talk about why this matters now. I'm going to use data largely from the US because that was just the easiest data to gather. And you'll be able to analyze this for your own country, no matter where you are, but you'll need to get some fairly current data. So let's just take a look at the US. We've got this from the OECD. And if we look at just the past few years of fixed broadband connections per 100 persons, that tells us some sense of the density. It's not a perfect measure, but there isn't a perfect measure. But you can see partway through our COVID experience that the number of people, the number of households subscribing to fixed broadband really started escalating. Was that caused by COVID? I don't know. But certainly that was the experience, I think, as a A scholar, I would say, well, I want a more careful analysis, but for public policy purposes, I would take this as a pretty good indicator that something's going on in the market that's highly correlated with our COVID experience. And it's not just the US. It's true also for all the OECD countries. You can see it's not as pronounced for the rest of the OECD, but you can see this bump up. People started relying upon fixed broadband more than they had prior to our COVID experience. And the reasons are fairly clear. We all know this, but here's some numbers that we put together here at PURC. If you go back to 2017, about 4 years before, 4 years earlier than now, 3 years before the pandemic, and you ask people, well, if you had to give up using Google or Bing or your search engine for a month, how much would I have to pay you? And they said, oh, well, almost $1,500. Well, what about what do I have to pay you to give up email? About $700. Now look at it in the very early stages of COVID. What you would have to pay someone to give up giving a search engine was almost $9,000 a month. $2,000 to give up email, over $1,000 to give up maps. So these are huge percentage jumps. That's how much we felt like we were relying upon electronic means of communications, of doing things. And indeed, that was all of our experiences, at least of everyone that I've spoken with. When you can't in person do things that you used to do, then we were able to turn to electronic means of doing them. We're very fortunate. Earlier pandemics, that had not been true. So we're fortunate we were able to, but that's what escalated that increased value for broadband, because these are things that we do through broadband. Now, it turns out you don't see that same kind of bump for mobile. At least we did not in the US. You'd have to look at your own country. And that may be what this is telling us is, well, one, that we already have 1.5 phones per person. So there's not a lot of room in the market for expanding that. It might also be telling us, because we still have this bump up in the fixed, that despite almost everybody having a mobile broadband connection, at least in the US, that it wasn't providing all the services they needed. Again, scholar-wise, I would want to study that much more deeply. Public policy-wise, where you have to make decisions in a very fixed time frame, I would take that as a good indicator that I'd really be wanting to be focusing in on what does the fixed type services do. They don't have to be hardwired. They can still be wireless, but the mobile just doesn't seem to be doing what people would want to do. So that's kind of what we're learning as we look at least the raw data for the experience with COVID. So we start worrying about, well, okay, so people valued internet access, broadband access a lot more during COVID than they had before. At least that's what it looks like. Were people able to get it as they wanted to? We hear a lot of anecdotal evidence about children unable to engage in learning, in their education, their schools, because they didn't have broadband. People being limited in what they could do with their healthcare because they lacked broadband, not being able to stay socially engaged because they lacked broadband. So we hear this anecdotal evidence. We want to be able to analyze that well. So how do we go about trying to figure out where are there problems and who's experiencing the problems? This is kind of the best practice that I've seen around the world. A lot of countries use this approach. In the US, we're kind of creeping into it. It took us a long time. I won't go into the horror stories as why. We used to not consider it this way at all. We're starting to now, but this is kind of best practice. What we do is in this rectangle, we kind of put all of our existing and potential broadband customers. They're all represented in that rectangle someplace, and we organize them. So those who are the lowest cost to serve are down here. The highest cost to serve are up here. Those who are willing to pay the most, willing and able to pay the most, are over here. Unable to pay, or maybe unwilling to pay, are put clear over here. And that organization allows us to very easily and carefully analyze where are our gaps. We have this rectangle that shows, well, these are the people that already have coverage. And you can probably do that for your own country. I'll talk in a little bit about how to do that. But these are the people that are lowest cost to serve, so industry is able to serve them very quickly. They have the highest revenue, so industry can pay for it. So maybe they don't all subscribe. That is a different issue, but they're certainly able to. Then we have this gap here that we call an efficient market gap. This is where the industry will cover it given time. It's economically possible, it's commercially viable, it just takes time. And so this is an efficient market gap. It's out here in this wide area where we have, no matter what happens, this area out here is never going to be commercially viable. Now, we actually break it into two gaps. One gap that says I need some capital investment support, a gap out here that says I need ongoing operations support, but these are where the subsidies start coming in. So we have people who already have coverage, people who will fairly soon, and then those that won't, and we might need some subsidies for them if our public policy is telling us that we want to do that. So this is our coverage gap out here. And so when we're worried about, do people have enough broadband in COVID, this is what we're really talking about. Let me explain about why I'm not so worried about this. Let's talk about just what the effects of COVID are on that coverage. One is it increases costs. If you're concerned about people are not getting broadband fast enough, when you accelerate deployment, that drives up costs. Doing something faster is just more expensive than doing something slower. We also have perhaps higher wages. That's true in my country. I don't know if it's true in yours or not, but material costs are certainly higher. Pretty much any place you go. Supply chains have been disrupted by COVID, and some of our lockdown policies have really disrupted supply chains. It's just physically hard to get things from one place to another. It's physically hard to build the materials, and so those costs are higher. But on the other hand, people now find a lot more valuable in broadband. So the demand has actually grown. And our politics is telling us that we're just a lot more impatient about this. Maybe in the past, when we've talked about this efficient market gap, we were saying, well, that's the part that'll maybe take 5 years or maybe even 10 years to fill. Our politics now are, we want it done in at least 12 months, no more than that, although that's probably not going to happen. It just takes more time than that, but we want to accelerate, and acceleration increases costs. So this efficient market gap is actually much smaller in all probability than it was before for you. So our coverage gap, this wide area out here, where public policy would step in to finance this, to make sure that the services get provided. And maybe it's smaller, maybe it's larger, and this is what you'd really want to understand. In my country, we just have the assumption that it's huge. And maybe it is, maybe it's not. We've not really taken time to analyze it. Politics is just impatient, and for good reason. If the growth of the willingness to pay, the demand, is greater than how much COVID is driving up costs, actually that coverage gap is shrinking. But excuse me, it grows. Oh, I got this backwards. Yeah, so if this willingness to pay, no, I've got it right. If the growth in willingness to pay is less than the growth in cost, then the coverage gap grows. It shrinks if the reverse is true. All right, so you want to know that for your own country. How do you know physically where this gap is? Well, locations wise, our Federal Communications Commission tracks that. You may track that or have a regulatory agency that tracks that in your own country. Scott Walston's Technology Policy Institute for the US has done extensive mapping and has really done an interesting job of that. I encourage anyone in the US to take a look at that. If you're outside the US, you might talk to Scott. Just Google Scott Walston, Technology Policy Institute, contact him and talk with him about how did you do that, because that could probably be done in your country with some of the approaches that they use, because they didn't get a lot of money for doing this. Broadband mapping can be really expensive. Scott and his team found a much less expensive way of doing it. NTIA in the US, Ookla, Facebook, Google, a lot of groups on Microsoft I could put in there as well, have done some work on where the broadband gaps are. Then you have speed tests as well. It's not just the physical availability, it's what is the speed. We worry about things like latency too. These are provided by a whole host of companies. Ookla is probably the most popular one, but there are several that do that. But just a caution, while you can get really interesting maps from these speed tests, understand what you're really mapping or what they're mapping is not what is possible given the infrastructure's that's there, but what a customer is actually doing in the moment that it's measured. And so we want to understand that it's not a perfect measure of, oh, there's no availability, or, oh, you know, it's what's there, it can't do very much. It's just telling us what the customers are doing. So it's a good indicator, but not the final answer. Now you want to be able to define what you mean by this gap as well. What kind of speeds are you talking about? For the Federal Communications Commission in the US, it's 25 megabits down. That's what you're downloading. 3 megabits going up. In the infrastructure bill, if you follow politics in the US, you will know that we're having debates over a $1.2 trillion infrastructure bill. If you look in it, it says that broadband is 100 megabits down. That's what you can download, 20 megabits going up. The EU broadband has 3 different definitions that I was able to find, 2, 30, and 100 megabits. I encourage people to think about it this way. Follow the customers. Customers will tell you what's valuable to them. So I would think about trying to do something maybe more like this. This is data from the US, and this is data that the FCC has gathered over the years. 2015 to 2019 is the data I have here. And it shows, now this adoption rate is a little bit of an odd number. I'm not going to try and pour into it. Basically, it's saying for 2019 that if a customer had available to it at least 10 megabits up, down, 1 megabit up, 77% of them bought that or more. If they had 25.3 available to them, 70% bought it or more. 55, 65% bought that or more. 100 megabits down, 10 megabits up, over 50% in 2019, this is pre-pandemic, bought that or more. If you jump up to 250/25, very few people bought that. So the way I would think about it in following customers telling me that if you're thinking about a gap in what type of broadband, this is where I'd be thinking about, maybe a little bit more than that since this is about 2 years old and is pre-pandemic. But certainly this is something that customers are now thinking about as normal. And that's what I would like to think about is I want services, I want targets that are normal for customers. I'm not getting ahead of them and saying, customers, I'm just smarter than you, you're not buying right stuff, or being way behind them. And customers look at what the policy targets are and say, well, that's nothing. That's like telling me, you know, I should be eating, you know, nothing but bread every day. That's just not relevant. But neither do I want to get way up here and say, you should be eating fine steaks and fine fish every day. That's just not realistic for customers either. So I like to see something that customers are really doing. So I encourage you to think about that. Have this kind of data for your own country and say, okay, where are customers? What are they doing? Now let's see if we can get everybody into that, or at least enough people, more people into that normal space. Then we have to think about, once we've said, here's our gap, and here's what we mean by the service in that gap, then we want to think about what's our real approach? How are we really going to go about doing this? And I like this quote by Thomas Sowell. He's one of my favorite economists. He's noted many years ago, said there are no such things as solutions. What you really have are just trade-offs. And what you really want to do is try to get the best trade-off you can. That's all you can really hope for. And so I wanted to just talk about trade-offs here. And this is debate that we're tending to not have in my own country. I don't know if you have it in yours or not. It's very rare to see studies that talk about trade-offs when it comes to broadband. Shane Greenstein, I think, made one of the best studies of this a very long time ago, but it's very rare to see this. And I just like to note to people that subsidies come from somewhere. So right now we're talking about subsidizing in my country $65 billion for broadband in this infrastructure bill that is currently going through Congress. Now that money comes from somewhere, and at the end of the day, it always comes from the citizens of the country. So where might that come from? Well, when taxpayers eventually pay for this, they will decrease the amount that they spend on housing by about $21 billion, 21 to 22 billion. They'll decrease their food expenditures by about 8 billion, their healthcare expenditures by about 5 billion, education by about 1.5 billion. And we just want to understand these are the trade-offs we're having. And if we think that that's the right trade-off, then that's what we should pursue. But we always want to think in terms of trade-offs because subsidies do come from someplace. Our citizens pay for those who want to make sure we do that well. And then there's a reality of working in the public arena. In our courses here at PURC, Araceli Castaneda teaches our leadership sessions. And part of that is practicing leadership in a political environment. And we just understand that the economy of politics works differently than the economy of business. And this is, again, Thomas Sowell from one of his books. And he says the first lesson of economics is scarcity. There's never enough of anything to satisfy everyone who wants it. But the first lesson of politics is to disregard the first lesson of economics. And that is just true in the political arena. Not that politicians are bad people. These are the people we vote for. These are the systems we have. We just want to make sure that we have the right kind of policy framework so this happens well. We think of it this way at PURC, that politics is telling us about all the things that we want, all the things that are important. So this is how we work together as a society. We define what's important, but only some of that is possible. In fact, it's only this area here. Given our knowledge of engineering, the economic realities, financial realities, our legal realities, this is all that's really possible. And then you have human systems. How well can we provide leadership? How well can we manage systems? What kind of relationships do we actually have? This is what we can really get done. And part of our jobs, and being scholars, regulators, operators, just concerned citizens, whatever your role might be, is to help your country find that spot. We don't want to spend our time out here because we'll never get it done. We don't want to spend our time over here because we don't want it. We want to be right in here. And it's hard to find that and find that well. And I think that's what Thomas is really trying to say here, is that there's scarcity, there's only so much you can really do, but our wants tend to be insatiable.
Hey, Dr. J?
Yes.
We have a question.
Mm-hmm.
Help me understand where the numbers for decreased spending come from. Why do we see this as the trade-off?
Yeah. So the question is, where did these numbers come from? All I did is I went to a household survey done by our Bureau of Census in the United States and looked at typical family budgets. I picked kind of middle income. And I said, here's how much people tend to spend on each of these items. And if we are taking dollars away from them, I'm assuming that they're going to be operating pretty close to their average. So I'm going to be off a little bit, but that's what I do. I just look at household budgets and say, okay, the household budget is going to shrink by 65 billion. Where's that 65 billion going to come from? Because people will spend less. Okay, great question. Thank you. All right, now let's take a look at some of our options for how we can go about trying to fill this gap. We've chosen for about the past 30 years or so to use competition amongst private operators to try and supply our broadband interests. So if you go back about 30 years ago, you will find that most countries of the world still had kind of government-owned monopoly providing telecommunications services. We were just at that time starting to move out of that system and to opening up markets. So what had been the effects of that? Why did we choose the system that we have now? Well, one is it gave us faster growth. I looked at some World Bank data and a study done by Scott Walston. He's now head of the Technology Policy Institute. He did a study of Africa and Latin America. There were a lot of studies done like this. I liked Scott's because he gave me numbers that I could work with very easily. Sometimes it's hard to make calculations from the study. All studies tended to find this. I just liked his the best because of the ease of being able to use it. He just found that growth went up quite a bit. I'll show you some of the numbers in a little bit, but basically a third, and that's the growth rate was basically a third higher. That's quite a bit. And it results in lower costs. We did a survey here of all of the privatization literature and tried to compare costs before privatization to costs afterwards, all of the different literature on that, and found that costs were about 10% lower. And so that's one of the things that drove us the direction that we are today into this space. And I did this study a few years ago, so you can see it only goes up to 2015. I just simply looked at the Caribbean and said, what would have happened in the Caribbean if it had not privatized and had mobile and fixed competition? And so this line is what we actually experienced with all the reforms. The reforms started happening in the early 1990s. And here's what I projected would have happened had we not had the reforms. And so you can see that early on, there's just low returns. That makes it kind of hard because people are going through transitions. They're trying to learn things differently. It's hard to see the wins, but out here, you really start to see the differences. And so this is why we're in the situation we are with competition, relying on competition and relying upon private operators, because all of us in talking about it thought that this is where we would end up. And indeed, I think we did. So that's where we are. But if you still have this gap, well, what are you going to do about that gap? If you've decided in your country that this gap probably ought to be filled, you've looked at the cost, you've looked at the benefits, you've done this very careful regulatory impact analysis. If you have time to, otherwise it's a pretty rough regulatory impact analysis, largely debated in the political arena. What are some of the options that you might have? Well, what I hear a lot of people talking about, and this started pre-COVID, is maybe we should go back to this government ownership, because people are kind of concerned that maybe the private operators aren't putting the investment where, as government, we would like for the investment to be. And we would expect people to feel that way, because the private operators are going to go where costs are lower and revenues are higher. People value broadband a lot, so they're willing to pay a lot for it. It's pretty cheap to provide it. So that's the best way to maximize that net benefit, is through that private decision-making by the consumers, by the operators, by their financiers as well. But in the public arena, we would be looking at where there is no broadband and say, well, it's not fair. People don't have it here. And for COVID, that's especially pronounced. And so maybe the government should start owning some of this broadband infrastructure. Well, here's what some of the effects of switching to government provision might be. This is again from Scott. So Scott found that the compound annual growth rate in subscriptions would be about a third lower if the government were the provider. Now, the government would tend to, at least early on, put the investment where people would say this is where we want it to be in the political arena, but it still slows down quite a bit. I'll get into why that's true later. And cost would be about 10% higher. But that's a trade-off. Remember, that's what Thomas Sowell told us. He said, there's no solving a problem. You just have trade-offs. These are some of the trade-offs. So to be able to have that system where you can say, we're going to put broadband over here, these are the kinds of trade-offs that you would have in doing that. So why is this true? Why is it that government would tend to have broadband grow more slowly and tend to be more expensive? Is it that people in government just aren't very smart? Well, that's not true, because the government could hire all the smart people that the industry does. So it's not that government's less intelligent. In fact, you might look here. This was an interesting quote I found in the Wall Street Journal just 2 or 3 days ago. It was looking at infrastructure, and saying, well, Amtrak, which is our passenger rail system in the US, it's government owned. The Wall Street Journal was pointing out it has never, ever recorded a profit, despite hiring very patriotic people who have lots of good private sector experience. They ran profitable companies in the private sector. When you got them into the government enterprise, still they couldn't make it work. And it's because government institutions are not designed to run a business. They're designed to carry out policy of the government, which means that they're very subject to the political pressures. And the political pressures are about the short run. They're about what people can see easily because we manage what we measure, sort of. That's pretty close to right. So that happens. In the private arena, people react to, well, where are my costs? Where are my potential revenues? So you're pursuing development where it gives the highest return for the customer and for the business as well. And that's why that the government tends to grow more slowly, grows business more slowly, and to be less efficient. It's just the institutional incentives are very different from that. And the government will actually end up delaying investment. This is a study here by Pablo Spiller out of Berkeley. The World Bank did a study, probably about 30 years ago now, I think it was, showing that how this functions, that in the early part of a government ownership, the government's responding politically to the citizens being upset, puts a lot of money into a system, but then when citizens get upset about something else, the government tends to pursue it and doesn't invest anymore in this, in our case, broadband. So this is just simply why. Government ownership might be something you're interested in, but just understand the trade-offs that you have. All right, so you have these problematic incentives. Can the government still be deeply involved in some way? Well, you might be able to remedy some of these problems with what we call P3s, public-private partnerships. So what about these? Well, let me first define what that is. A public-private partnership is just a contractual arrangement between the government and a private entity to provide some sort of public infrastructure or services. So it might be a public-private partnership for providing waste management. It might be for providing public transportation services, different things like that. So what we'd wonder is, are there public elements to broadband? Because P3s work well for certain kinds of things, but not for others. If you've ever studied the history of telecommunications in the United States, you might be surprised to learn that actually you go back over 100 years ago when utilities and telecommunications were first starting in the US, they looked a lot like public-private partnerships. That's effectively what they were. Not well done, but that's what they looked like. And there's reasons why we did not stick with this, because sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't, depends upon the context. Most studies of the government providing services in broadband, so I'm just narrowing it down to broadband now, I'm not talking about all the other utilities, just broadband, finds that the government providing the service largely doesn't work for all those problems we just talked about in the government being a business provider. But there's a study by this Coalition for Local Internet Choice and the Benton Institute, where they looked at successful public-private partnerships in broadband. What they found, and I've not dug through the study to know that all their cases were done correctly, so I can't attest to it. You'll need to study it for yourself. Here's the link. They found that the public-private partnerships, the P3s, were successful if they were limited to things like conduit or dark fiber. And this is something that wouldn't surprise me as being true. Because one of the challenges in broadband for a public-private partnership, or for government to be involved at all, is how rapidly, there are two problems. One is how rapidly the technology changes, and the other one is competition. If you have competition, it's really hard for the government to have partnerships with entities that are competing, or have a partnership with one that's competing with others. The government just tends to favor its own providers, its own partner. So the competition becomes a problem. The rapid change in technology can be a problem because we write contracts for particular kinds of deliverables. And if our customers and the businesses find that there's a whole new deliverable that'd be wonderful for the customers to have, they want to buy it, but it's not in the contract, then we have a problem as well. But we won't tend to see rapid changes in conduit. There are changes that happen in fiber optics, but maybe if we keep the contract at a reasonable length, that will still work as well. So maybe that can be made to work, but that's different than having a public-private partnership for the service. So if you look at my country and the infrastructure bill that we have, it's all about service. So it's going to be hard to use public-private partnerships well in a US context for our infrastructure bills because it's targeting service. If it were instead to back up and say, well, let's have public-private partnerships for the infrastructure to provide service. Let's focus on conduit, trenching, whatever that might be, pole, not poles so much, that's harder. But maybe for conduit, maybe for dark fiber, that might be feasible. Understanding though, sometimes you're still competing with others who've already put in dark fiber, who've already put in conduit. So you have to study that and work that out very carefully as well. But if you're talking about places where there is no service, then maybe this starts working. So we just want to make sure that we have good, stable technology. So where might these public-private partnerships work? Well, it's going to be where there's a stable technology so you can write a good contract, because it's a contract between the government and the private entity. We do not want the government competing with the private entity. Excuse me. And I'd really encourage people to think about having a transparent auction process for the public-private partnership. Too often, in my opinion, we see entities, government, private sector negotiating these, or maybe having beauty contests for these. What we've discovered, and this is best practice around the world, the US has been adopting this very slowly, but it's to have what we call a reverse auction, which simply says, let's say we're going to do it for conduit. It would look something like this. All right, we're going to have a public-private partnership for conduit. Here's the areas where we want to have conduit. We think, this is government speaking, that it's costs maybe $1 million a mile to put in the conduit. So that's what we're willing to and since subsidize. It's the money to be made up in fees you would charge the people putting fiber in it, plus what the government will provide, because it's not financially viable, absent some government subsidies. So it's saying that here's our target. Now, who would be willing to do it for 950,000 instead of $1 million? And somebody says, yeah, I can do that. And so, all right, let's lower the number. Who would do it for 900,000? And so you run the auction, but driving the price down for the amount that's going to be subsidized. And we found that this actually saves a lot of money. Sarah's an economist that works with Scott Walston, who I've been bragging about probably too much. She did a very recent study of these reverse auctions and found that it gets twice as much broadband as the beauty contest, the government grants, or cuts the costs in half, whichever way you want to look at it. So that's pretty substantial. So if you're thinking about, like the US spending $65 billion, well, you could probably get just as much broadband if you use this reverse auction for $32.5 billion, and you can save the taxpayers a lot of money. Or maybe you get twice as much broadband, or something to that scale, depending on what the actual cost curves are going to look like. But that's a big savings from using these reverse auctions instead of the beauty contest. A friend of mine here in Florida, Joe Galland. Joe is an economic consultant, works largely for small fiber optics companies. He studied the FCC's process and found that it saved 70% against the old subsidy system for subsidizing broadband. So this transparent auction process can be very, very beneficial. So if you're thinking about using P3s, I'd encourage you, focus in on stable technologies. You're not competing with the private entities, and using a transparent auction process. There's an infrastructure policy institute at Cornell University that does really good work on public-private partnership areas. They talk about why this is so important is because you can contract in the maintenance. Remember back here, I talked about one of the problems is the government delays. I said delays investment here. Similarly, government tends to not maintain infrastructure real well, especially if people can't see it. The folks at Cornell explained that you can, with a P3, you can lock in that maintenance with the private entity. It's contractual. It's not up to whatever the political winds might be. So you can actually get that locked in and use some good private incentives for that. So they do a good job in that area. PURC, we have our own experts on public-private partnerships. Ted Curry does a great job in this area. So there are a lot of people who can help you if you're unfamiliar with how to do them. All right, another way that people talk about maybe the government can help out is by controlling prices. Maybe these private entities just charge too much. Maybe we could control prices. That was actually one of the things being thought about and kicked around here in the US. That's dropped out of the legislation. Maybe it'll come back in some other form, but right now it's kind of off the table, at least for the moment. But if you're thinking about this, how do we typically hear people think about it? Generally, we would expect them to talk about, well, let's focus in on where there are poor customers, people who just can't afford service, or there's weak competition. And so we might see a regulated price or maybe a targeted subsidy for poor customers. We wouldn't provide a targeted subsidy with this weak competition. That would instead be a price control. What we want to pay attention to here is, are we sure that customers are price sensitive? When I started out in regulation, this would have been back in the 1980s. We all believed, I was a telecommunications regulator, we all believed that customers were very price sensitive in telecommunications. And we found out over time, once we started actually studying it, that they were not. And then, so that meant that a lot of our price controls weren't having the effects that we thought they would, or thought they were. And then it also turned out when we very specifically started targeting subsidies to poor customers, because we thought, well, okay, maybe the general population is not sensitive to prices for telephone service, now broadband. Certainly the poor customers are, but the studies have tended to show that that's rarely true as well, that the price isn't the biggest issue. So what I'd encourage you to think about is, if you believe that subsidies for poor customers, or where there's weak competition, this would be really important, be sure to conduct a study as best you can, because it might be that you pursue a policy that does not help you out in the end. You're not reaching your goals, you're not filling that gap with subscriptions. So it's an example of how we might do that. Price cap services typically for poor customers. In the UK, Ofcom had a really interesting approach of how they price capped services just for the very smallest of customers. It's kind of really long and difficult to show you what that looks like. David Sappington teaches that in our course, but it's, so those of you that have been to our courses, you know all about it. But it's a clever approach. But again, does it have an impact on subscription? Well, that's what you'd have to decide for your own country. And this is the part about our poor customers, truly price sensitive. Because if they're not, then we're wasting our time trying to benefit them that way. Now, there is another argument for trying to benefit poor customers besides, do they buy the service or not? And it is about what do customers do with the price decrease? So let's say that a full price broadband is $30 a month. You provide a $15 subsidy. Even if the same number of poor people buy broadband, they now have $15 extra. What do they do with that? I noticed one of my colleagues, Lynn Holt, is with us here. Lynn and I did a study on that a long time ago and found out that what customers in the US at least tended to do, poor customers, they would use that $15 to buy other communication services. So they didn't use it to buy more food, more housing, whatever. They used it to buy other communication services. That was really interesting. So if that's what you're very interested in, maybe that can actually accomplish what you would like to do. All right, we also want to be careful though. If we're controlling prices, we might actually bias the market towards large providers. I've talked to some small internet service providers in the US. They're kind of concerned about some of the regulatory ideas because they think that the big guys can do it much better than they can. And that very well could be true because a low price cap means that the operator has to get its profits someplace else. Then you have to be big enough to get it someplace else. And so that bias starts biasing the market towards large providers. Is it a big bias? I don't know. Probably not, but at least there's somewhat of a bias. This regulatory cost is the one that I think tends to be more pronounced. And we actually have, I've seen 2 or 3 studies that look into this. If we're providing regulation where it's maybe not really necessary, it starts making the industry look like it has these economies of scale. There's certainly an economy of politics, and that favors larger firms. So the more regulated the industry is, the bigger the firms tend to be. So we just want to be careful and think cautiously about what we do here. Are we actually going to get the results that we want with this particular approach? And you'd have to decide that for your own situation. Now we have just a few minutes left. And I want to talk about, all right, so we've decided that we have this coverage gap, and maybe there's an adoption gap as well, and it's not commercially viable on its own. So we're going to need some sort of subsidies. Where do we get that kind of money? Okay, we're going to talk about some different options. Maybe we can just tax big tech. They got a lot of money. Maybe we can do that. Maybe the internet service providers can actually charge these big tech companies. So rather than the government go try and collect it, maybe they could just charge them for internet access. Or maybe there can be fees placed on the internet service providers or on customers. This is the typical approach. Or maybe it can come from general funds, general taxpayers. That's where the $65 billion talked about in the US is coming from right now under the current legislation being discussed. But the thing I'd encourage you to remember is at the end of the day, customers pay for everything. Even if you tax big tech, they're going to pass on those costs to somebody else. If internet service providers charge the big tech companies are going to pass it on to somebody else. Fees are going to be passed on to someone else. General funds are paid for by the taxpayers. All we're really saying is we're not going to take money out of one person's pockets necessarily, dependably. We're going to take it out of everybody's pockets, which is the best mechanism for making that cash flow work. And there are trade-offs, as Thomas Sowell would tell us. So why does big tech look tempting? This is actually a policy that is being talked about a lot by a commissioner at our FCC here in the US, Brendan Carr. He says, look, the big tech companies have a lot of money. We actually ought to be requiring them to subsidize the broadband because they're some of the biggest beneficiaries of broadband. And he's right in the sense of the beneficiary, being the beneficiaries. So look at this particular graph here. I developed this graph. This shows what we call, it's kind of like net debt if you're an accountant, but it's not exactly like that. So I took the cash that companies have on hand, plus their kind of short-term financial investments, and subtracted out their debt. And I started with the introduction of the iPhone. It's looked at Facebook, Alphabet, who owns Google, Microsoft, Twitter, and Netflix. How much of this cash minus debt do they have on hand? A lot. This has been very cash positive for them all over this time, up to almost $300 billion. Look at the network providers in the US. AT&T, Verizon, T-Mobile, and eventually T-Mobile buys Sprint. What's happened to their finances? Because they're the ones building the networks upon which all this business value is created. They have largely gone into debt to do this. Now, they're not financially bad shape. They all manage their finances just fine. Just simply saying that when a person like Commissioner Carr looks at these numbers, here's what he sees, that comparing cash to debt has been growing much faster for these companies than for these. And so people scratch their heads and say, there must be a lot of value. Shouldn't these people be paying for this value? Now, they do in some sense, because if you look at investments in fiber optics, Facebook, Google, Netflix sort of, depending upon how you categorize it, are investing a lot in fiber optics. They're building their own internets. They're just internal internets. So they are indeed seeing a lot of value in it. But a lot of this money looks like, well, maybe they should be paying something for it. All right, let's talk about that. If you're thinking about taxing big tech, understand this gets really hard because Facebook and Google just had a fight, if you will, with Australia. It was about subsidizing journalists, but the question was, could you really tax big tech, force them to subsidize someone else? Almost blew up in everyone's faces. They finally got it worked out, but it wasn't easy. So you'd want to think very carefully about, what's my mechanism here? Does your country really have the clout to get these companies' attentions? Sometimes you can't, and it gets difficult. Would they find a way to simply pass on the cost to citizens? Of course. Businesses don't pay taxes. The customers pay taxes. So the companies would indeed find a way to pass it on. They just always do. And that's simply because investors are always able to go someplace else. It's hard to grab an investor and say, I'm going to take your money for tax purposes, because they simply say, oh, I just won't invest in Facebook anymore. I'll go someplace else. Ask the question of, what if, as a broad policy, what if every country tried to do this? See, these numbers this is the US portion. If you said, well, let's do this across the world, this money doesn't make much of a dent in this money. So it's not a big solution around the world anyway.
Dr. J, it's 10:53.
Okay. All right, I'll wrap up.
Questions.
All right, thank you. So let me skip right to this one. Perhaps instead of having a tax, perhaps we would just simply deal with the net neutrality issue and say, internet service providers, you can just charge edge providers for the value that they get from the network. That way it could be managed commercially. Having 5G makes this easier. It would not subsidize a lot of broadband, but it would help some. And so we could do it that way. And that's why we would see, for example, Google and Facebook have both gone into Africa, maybe Latin America as well, and provided broadband cheaper, because they were able to finance it in part through their edge services. Okay, fees on ISPs. This is our typical way of doing things. It is indeed passed on to customers. I worked for an internet service provider one time. This is what we did. Typical practices based on revenue, regulatory fees, spectrum fees. This is typical. We can see it in many places on how it's done. General funds, economists tend to like taking things out of general funds. Politicians do not, because you're taxing citizens. Citizens don't like to be taxed. It's hard to win the next election. If you tell the citizens, I'm going to raise your taxes, even if you say I'm going to give you broadband for it, they would say, well, we can buy broadband ourselves. I don't need you to tax me and then use it to subsidize broadband. So it doesn't tend to work quite as easily. All right, our key points. Then I'll quit, and I apologize for talking so long. Analyze very carefully whether you need more or less subsidy. Remember that demand has grown and costs have grown. So compare cost, there's change in cost, change in demand. Where are customers really at this point? Why is it that people don't subscribe? Because we've been surprised with people that when we think it's all a price issue, it's turned out to not be. There are other reasons they don't like to use broadband. If the government if you're thinking about government provision, note that there are some inefficiencies that will be created, but there are trade-offs. If for some reason you still pursue it, just understand what the efficiencies are. Try to minimize them with a public-private partnership for maybe the stable monopoly components, and using reverse auctions for the contracts to make them very economical. And you have to write these contracts really, really well. We minimize the subsidies, maybe by dropping net neutrality requirements, let the internet service providers charge more for value added that they might do for the edge, and then auctioning the subsidy. All right, so I've talked too long. We've got 4 minutes left. We can go a little bit longer if we need to. Any questions that people might have?
We do not have any questions in the chat room, but if people want to unmute and ask a question.
Yeah, or disagreements. Maybe I said something that was wrong, or at least that you think was wrong. And discussing it is probably a really good idea.
Mark, this is Tom McCabe.
Hey, Tom.
Just a comment with regard to the reverse auctions. I think there's a lot to still to see what happens there. I think most of the reverse auctions that you saw, the winners tended to be satellite provider or WISPs, wireless service providers. And typically what we've seen from customers is the quality of that service is not very high and the price is very high. So the customers don't like it. So you have these federal subsidies going to a technology that is not proving to be very successful, that now you're trying to see other technology come in to replace that. So you've got government state grant programs that are trying to replace some of these with wireline connections, with fiber to the home. And then the second one is, I've heard a lot of people that have won some of those reverse auctions that they bid so low that they are desperately trying to find additional funding mechanisms. So while they may be getting these federal grants, they may not be able to build out the network because they priced it too low.
All right, Tom, so thank you for your comments on that. So just understand that reverse auctions are not unique to the US. We've done them all over the world. And you do have to design the contracts very carefully because you're buying something and you want to make sure you're buying what you really do want. And you have to design the auctions well. Now, nobody designs auctions better than the FCC. Evan Quirrell, Paul Milgram, the people who've designed these spectrum auctions do it incredibly well, so you can deal with the winner's curse. That's what Tom was talking about. People bid too low. You need some experienced bidders and such as that. So and then you also, by the government design, want to make sure that if somebody's bid too low, you have a mechanism. And this is the mechanism for dealing with it. This is common in private business, that if you negotiate a contract with someone and the person you have the contract with can't perform, what do you then do? And so we want to make sure as government, you deal with that as well. But thank you for the comments, Tom. And so you really want to talk with people who've had experiences in it and see what the best practices are. Good point.
Hey, Dr. Day, we got another question. Oh.
Okay.
Go ahead. Sorry. Dr.
Okay.
Day, can you actually stop sharing your screen?
Oh, sure.
Thank you. Sorry, go ahead.
Hey, Mark, John Reed. Nice to see you and hear you again.
Sure. Hi, John.
Just a couple comments. One is I've had the fortunate experience of being from Canada, living in and working in the Caribbean, and also living in the States. So I kind of see the environment's a little different than most. And one thing I would comment on when it comes to either government subsidies, I'll say government subsidies. I think for sure in the US, everything is political for one thing, unlike the other developing countries and even a lot of the Commonwealth countries. And citizens tend to be more prone to respond favorably to the welfare of the many rather than the welfare of the individual. So I don't necessarily think that taxation, when they see the common good, is something to be dismissed outright. I would love to see some studies in the Caribbean countries on that, but that's my take. The other thing, of course, as the former CEO of a telecommunications company, I'm always a proponent of charging at the edge. So I do believe that those companies, and hey, listen, I've got shares in a lot of those companies, and regardless of you can take your money somewhere else, there's not too many companies in that space that had that growth projectile as these companies have. So I really think that riding over that network largely at no cost and generating massive returns, while many telecom companies are suffering certainly on declines in revenue and certainly debt, as you've indicated, I still think that's a viable option. So that's just my 2.5 cents, sir.
All right, thank you, John. And John's got a lot of experience. He was a guest 2 or 3 times on our next Practice Live. So thank you for sharing all that. Yeah, indeed. The experiences, the cultures are different everywhere you go. So I try to be really cautious about what I say, here's how things are. Blair, I see we have a comment and question from Dorothy. Okay, hello, Dorothy, good to hear from you. Dorothy, for those of you that don't know Dorothy, she was chairman for the Uganda Communications Commission. I interviewed her in one of our next Practices Live, and she's also author of a chapter that we're doing, I think for Eric. I think Eric's on here as well. A book that Eric is putting together on telecom responses to the COVID. She's asked, what are the key issues we need to consider about net neutrality, especially in light of greater demand in these days of the new normal? So I'm going to give you the perspective of someone who, I talk to people all over the world, but I sit in the US, so always flavor or to understand that context of me. What we have found, I've only seen 3 studies, but what we found with net neutrality is that the fewer of those types of regulations we've had, the better the networks have performed during COVID. And it's just because of the flexibility the operators have had. At least that's my opinion. It's hard to study the why. You can more easily study the what. So what I would think about with respect to net neutrality was to say, rather than have the kind of controls that say, operators, you shall not do these things, is simply have the rules that if you damage competition or you behave, if you use your market power to harm someone, then I'll respond. And that way the operators can indeed work out how much can we charge an edge operator? What kinds of ways can we enhance our networks to to benefit people who are willing to pay more for different types of network access, whatever that might be. Then that way the operators can balance both sides of the market, or all 3 sides, depending upon how you look at it, without having constraints that actually discourage investment. So I would think about it as an ex post regulation as opposed to an ex ante. Let's see. Now we also have a question from Judith. What is my thinking about A4AI's meaningful connectivity definition, especially in developing countries? Judith, I'm just not familiar with it, so I could not tell you for sure. Okay, so Dr. Emma Atieno, I'm sorry if I mispronounced your last. I'm really bad with pronouncing names. She says, explain a little bit more about on that finding regarding pricing not being an issue for the poor. What was the established reason behind this perspective? So there's a couple of studies that I'm talking about. Well, there's a bunch of studies there. So sometimes what we would do is we'd have a study that looks at our subsidies for the poor people, and we would ask the question, as those subsidies increased, did the number of poor people subscribing to telecommunication service increase? And the answer was almost no. There'd be a very tiny bump up. Most poor people actually went ahead and paid. Now, this is a US study, so to always take that into context. So that's what we found in those types of studies. The studies I did with my colleague Lynn Holt is we did surveys of customers and of low-income households and asked them about their buying of telecommunication services and their use of the subsidies. We found very few that actually were aware of the subsidies or used them. So most of the people who were signing up for the subsidies already had phone service. And then there was a study, this is the one that I know about that's related to broadband. Again, this was done by Scott Wallstein. I think Greg Roston out of Stanford was part of this study as well. the Federal Communications Commission in the US did an experiment many years ago now, about 10 years ago, to look at, are there ways of benefiting poor households so that they'd be more likely to buy broadband? And Scott and Greg, I think Greg was involved, did a study of all of these studies that the FCC had done, and found that even if you charge the poor households only $1 for broadband, a lot of them still would not buy it. And I don't remember what the rationale was that the poor households gave for that, but it just tended to not be a price issue. And a few other people have done some studies. George Ford did one recently on that as well, and again found it just wasn't a price issue, which surprises me. And I don't have a good explanation for it. It's just what the data say. So what I'd really want people to think about is try to talk with as many people as you can and ask them, if broadband's available to you and it's really important for education, healthcare, why is it you don't describe? And see if we can solve those problems and not just simply treat it as we have, clear back when I was involved in the regulation, treat it as a price issue, because we were just wrong in treating it that way. Let's see, anything else? That's all I have in the chats. There's
a few, Andre Griffith, I don't know if I'm saying that correctly, it had a question for you also. And there's one from Denton Williams.
Oh, okay, here's Andre's. Oh, hi, Andre, how you doing? Let's see, how do you establish a feasible starting price for reverse auction? Okay, so the way that people tend to do it is they will have some engineers look at the service area where you're talking about and estimate what it might cost to provide service there. Peru and Chile pioneered this effort. This is clear back in the early 1990s. And that's essentially what they did. The regulatory engineers went out and looked in the areas where there was no service, what would it cost to establish it, and that was their starting price. And the FCC, you'd have to talk to somebody a little bit more involved in it. I think they started at kind of close to what the current subsidy was, although I know they did some cost studies as well. So it's based upon the government's best estimate, tended to be the government's best estimate of what it would cost. And that's where we started. If your ability to soundly price the infrastructure, where is the gap coming from? So the gap comes from that it costs this much to provide the service and the price is here. And so a commercial provider just simply won't make the investment. But we want to know exactly what that financial gap is. And that's why we do the reverse auction. And sometimes Chile and Peru found out that sometimes actually there was no financial gap, that the operator simply had not thought about providing service in some of these areas. And when the government said, hey, here's this area, we're going to have a reverse auction, they looked at it and said, we don't need a subsidy for that. We'll go in there and provide service. So that can happen as well. Okay, Denton Williams said in the UN target, 2 to 5% of GNP income per capita is a guide for pricing and market effectiveness. I've seen that the World Bank was involved in doing some of that quite a few years ago as well. I think 3% was their benchmark. That's fine. It doesn't tell us, though, what consumers' actual behavior is. If that's the best you have, then there's probably nothing wrong with or at least it's better than simply guessing. But I'd like to know more about customers. I always like for customers to tell me what they're really willing to do by watching their behaviors. But if that's the data you have, then that's what you have to start with. And you'd want to start gathering some additional data to know better in the future. So I'm glad you brought that up, though. I should have introduced that myself. All right, we've got about 10 minutes over. Any last questions, comments? I really appreciate people chiming in on some of this. Let's see, here's David Cox. The reason is that not everyone sees the value of a broadband connection, especially true for poor communities in developing countries. Very well could be. David's from St. Lucia, does a lot of work around the Caribbean and Latin America. So David has a lot more hands-on personal experience than I do. And it might just be a knowledge gap. That was an interesting finding South Africa quite a few years ago now, when they first started developing Telecenters, for those of you old enough to remember telecenters, once people experienced phone service, they went and got their own mobile phone. The same is probably true for broadband as well. Once people experience it, they just, wow, this is great stuff. And so that's a good point that David's bringing up. Hidayat, good to see him. He's a great friend from Albania. Even though he's not able to join from the very beginning, yeah, good to talk with you. If you don't know him, sharp guy to talk with. A lot of broad, good experience around the world. David Cox, again, some communities don't have credit cards. They don't purchase things online or pay bills online. They don't have social media, is not interested in it. Seemed strange to many of us. I get that. And so one of the things, I just saw this study this morning, that one of the things we've experienced in the US is that people started doing a lot more financial transactions online. People had never done it before during COVID. So this may be a learning experience for the poor people, especially in your own country. If you can provide really low cost financing. Now that gets way outside of telecommunications. It gets into the blockchain technologies and just how expensive it is to do business in our typical financial systems. So that's something to talk with people about in your countries. Is there a way of lowering the cost of using the financial system? That can help out quite a bit. Disagree, it's not a price issue. It may be a price issue for the service, price issue and access device, and the relevance of the service, their daily lives. Leads to be very careful about translating studies from the first world to Caribbean. I agree, Craig. I did premise everything on these were U.S. studies. The other thing we did learn, though, and this was clear back when I very first started in regulation, is that the price that customers were most sensitive to were the cost of establishing service, not so much the monthly cost. So they weren't sensitive to the monthly cost, but were sensitive to the cost of establishing service. So think about that. Again, I don't have an answer for your country. All I have are the studies, my discussions, my ability to analyze. So I hope that you find it all very helpful. All right. Very good. Okay. I think that kind of wraps us up. Thank you all for your attention. I've enjoyed the time with you. I hope that we find ways to engage and work together. Our job here is to give you everything we know so that you can solve your own problems. We're not experts in your country. All we do is study deeply and work with a lot of people around the world and hopefully provide you with the best information, the best tools we can. All right, Blair, I'm going to turn things back over to you.